Hello there, I'm Tony Harris.
And I'm Paul Howarth,
Welcome to the Twilight Turntable.
where we encourage you to revive the lost art of listening.
One late night long player at a time. Hello, Paul.
Hello there, Tone. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. What fettle?
Fine, Fettle, thanks. All the better for speaking to you, of course.
Oh, you're too kind. So here we are, the Twilight Turntable.
We're at the Twilight Turntable, and I'm
We're at
excited.
the good. Well, let's explain for, as you've called them, the listening few,
For listening several,
what this is all about. What this is all about. Which is, as you know, because I often text you with what I'm up to.
Mm-hmm.
In the last sort of hour before bed,
Yeah.
instead of watching that last episode on of a box set binge watch,
Mm-hmm.
I instead listened to an album. And when I say listen, I put it on and I don't do anything else. And that's why we talk about wanting to resurrect the lost art of listening, because I think music has tended to become a bit of a soundtrack to us doing other things.
Mm.
Whereas actually, I remember growing up and nothing was more exciting than a new long player, 33 and a third RPM, going onto the turntable, and you would just sit and listen to it with nothing but the album sleeve artwork and notes for company.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I do every night. And we thought it would be quite interesting to try and convert people.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously my first convertee
Yep.
is one of my old partners in crime and somebody who I know has very good taste in music, which is you. And I thought how we would do this is that I would select an album
Yep.
that I thought you might like and be interested in,
Yep.
but had probably not got much experience of. You may know little bits of it, but it
Yep.
wasn't really in your bailiwick, as it were.
Yep.
So that's what we're going to do. And that's what the Twilight Turntable is all about. It's in honor of my late night listening endeavors.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping to encourage you and more people to do more of it
Well,
and to actually study them.
I'm a very willing pupil, so perhaps you'd like to
Well,
let people know what my first piece of homework was.
your first piece of homework was this album, which I'm holding up to the camera. For those of you who, if we ever manage to do this as a visual enterprise, though I suspect that's going to be too much for all of us. It's it's the 1966 album "Face to Face" by the Kinks.
Yep.
Now, I am a big fan of the Kinks. Everybody knows a bit about the Kinks. But I quite like this. I know most people will think I'm still some sort of teen prodigy, but actually, this was a record that was written and recorded almost around the time that I was born.
Go away.
Yes, it's as old as I am. And it was released in October 66. And I find it a really interesting album because I think it's the start of what becomes the Kinks imperial period of albums. Most people will tend to start it with the next one, which is Something Else by the Kinks. It then goes to Village Green Preservation Society. But I think this is a really interesting album because it's marking that period when bands had stopped just thinking about their singles, which had always been the 45 had always been the most important thing, and albums were ways of keeping fans interested in between the 45 releases. But actually, if you see in 66 with Aftermath by the Stones and Revolver by the Beatles, that and with this with Face to Face, that actually the long playing record could be more of a message for those bands, and that's what they're trying to do. And certainly I think that's the case here. So I've spoken quite a lot. Let me say, did you like it?
I loved it. Yeah, so as you say, I will know bits and bobs of the albums that you select for me, and this one I had only ever heard Sunny Afternoon, which everyone knows.
Everyone
And
knows.
it's possibly a little bit overlooked because it's probably been played so much over the years. So that was the only one. So apart from that, I was listening to this album afresh. So transported
Good.
back 58 years to listen. And yeah, I absolutely loved it. Um, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, you've spoken about that kind of bridge between their earlier work, things like "You Really Got Me," which is those you've referred to this in the past as kind of proto-punk almost singles,
Yeah.
really raw. And then they went on to do Waterloo Sunset and all that stuff that people know. And this feels like something in the middle. And I loved it. It was really parts of it reminded me a lot of the Beatles. So so the first track, which is
Naturally, they're the alpha
you,
and omega of the
you can't
time.
you
So
can't
yes,
you
yeah.
can't speak about that time without speaking about the Beatles, probably much to the annoyance of bands like the Kinks, who are very much their own thing. And yet the first track, I mean, one thing I loved, actually, I was really surprised to hear this album start with a telephone ringing.
That's
And
right.
actually, we might come back at the end to speak about this, because it made me think, I wonder how many other albums there are that start with that sound effect of a phone ringing. So at the end of this,
Okay.
we might come back to that. Um, but then it's into this track, which is a brilliant, I think it's a great sort of pop song, called Party Line. But it does remind me quite a lot of things like I Feel Fine by the Beatles.
Yes, I
And
think that's right. Yeah.
yeah, and then the final track, I'll Remember, is a really sweet, the kind of that sweet Beatles-ish thing, which I think they recorded that one actually the year before the Kinks.
They
And
did. It's a
maybe,
hangover from
yeah,
earlier sessions. I mean, it sounds like something off Help to me.
right,
It's
right.
got that kind of feel about it. So you're right. That's slightly softer, a little bit more acoustic. Whereas Party Line is a real thumper.
Yeah, it is. It's a belter to start the album.
I'm on a party line, wondering all the time who's on the other end. Is she big? Is she small? Is she a she at all? Who's on my party line? Wish I had a more direct connection. Remember everything you said to me. I remember everything you said to me.
But despite the fact that you have those two tracks bookending the album, everything in between is weird and different and interesting in
Yeah.
lots of diverse kind of ways. Um, so spoken about a bit of Beatles influence there. I think that vocally, both Ray and Dave Davis, um, when they really sort of go for it on certain tracks, it comes across as a bit jaggerish. So what is it?
Interesting.
There's a track called towards the end of the album called "You're Looking Fine," and actually I think that would have been a better Stones tune. I think they should have gone to Mick and Keith and said, "Lads, this one's for you."
It's
Um,
definitely slightly rougher, and it's got a sort of slightly sleazy shuffle on it.
yeah,
It's quite a
yes,
sort of Keith, sort of slightly looser.
yes. What else? Oh, "House in the Country," which I'm sure we'll speak about a bit because that's been a very influential track, I think. But again, the Jagger-esque vocal on that, I think it's Ray does that one, and I think Dave does "You're Looking Fine."
I saw her, she looked out of sight, and I said, "You're looking fine, you're looking fine, you're looking fine," and I feel alright. Yes, I feel all.
So a bit Jaggerish. So you got a bit of Beatles, a bit of Stones. Um, but then there's also what I would consider to be their sort of heartland, which is this sort of character-driven um, kitchen sink almost kind of drama stuff
Yeah.
that you see in tracks on this album, like "Rosie, Won't You Please Come Home," which is the second track on the album, which is just a beautiful track, probably my favorite track on the album actually, or "Session Man," or "House in the Country," or "Most Exclusive Residence for Sale," or "Little Miss Queen of Darkness." It's all these, or even "Dandy," which is a funny, jokey little track, I think, but still really good. Um, So yeah, you get this observational, very English kind of writing, I think. Which, as I say, that's very much theirs. Well, you can see influences elsewhere, but that sort of approach, I think, is very Kinksy.
Well, I
Um,
think the interesting thing about the English influence
mm,
is at the time they'd had this run in the States,
yeah,
and they'd kind of been banned from playing in the States.
mm,
They I think allegedly Ray had said something rude or maybe even decked some musicians union official,
yes,
and that had had them banned from America.
yeah,
And they didn't go back to America for several years.
mm,
And I think that probably just made them withdraw more to go, well, we'll write for our,
mm,
the influences we see around us. And actually, you see that come through a little more in the way the Beatles write, the way the Stones
mm,
write, the way the Who write. They all sort of, for that period,
mm,
because this really is kind of swinging England.
yes.
Um,
I'm thinking Union
and
Jack minis.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the cover is sort of, it's all pop art
Yeah,
and things like that, and it has that kind of ambiance about it, and
yes,
everybody sort of picks it up, and it's sort of, you see these lovely films of sort of King's Road in the 60s and guys in grenadier
yeah,
guard jackets and stuff like
yeah,
that. And it feels they sort of feel like they start that, and I
yeah,
think that's why they're so held up as sort of an influence on Britpop
yes,
as it comes later, because that's the time when that scene is sort of replicated.
yes. I mean, all the bands that grew up around that time, from the early to mid 60s, will have grown up with things like skiffle and
Yeah,
kind of even music hall, and you can hear those influences sometimes. Sometimes you get that real sort of shonky piano sound, which
yeah.
which they put into a lot of their tracks. But even I don't know if they were influenced by French cinema. Maybe that's just because you get quite a lot of harpsichord on this record, which I really, really love, by the way. So that track I mentioned, "Rosie, Won't You Please Come Home," feels really arty, like art house cinema almost.
Rosie, will and tell me if you don't want to come back. I will sacrifice all I have to have a happy
The
home.
Yeah,
harpsichord is one of the great 60s session men, which is Nicky Hopkins,
yes,
who plays with everybody in the 60s.
yeah,
And, it is much admired, and people speak very highly of all his contributions to
yeah,
um to the recordings. And the effect that he has on that is huge. The interesting about Rosie, Won't You Please Come Home is that
mm.
Rosie was one of uh, Ray and Dave's beloved sisters.
Oh,
They
really?
he had I think it was five elder sisters,
Yeah,
and Ray was born, and he was the youngest, and he was
yeah,
the baby boy, and
yeah,
he had all these um um huge characters were his sisters who'd sort of helped look after him, in the family home up in Fortis Green in near East
hmm,
Finchley, near where I used to live.
yeah,
Um, and Rosie is the one, I believe I'm right, is the one who'd emigrated to Australia,
right,
and he was very close to it. If you listen to the last hit they ever had,
mm.
which was in '84, I think it was "Come Dancing."
Oh God, yeah. Sorry, not one of
Right?
my faves.
No, not one of your face, but that was actually written about him watching his elder sisters going out and having a night out at the local
Yeah,
dance hall, as it
yeah,
was. I never liked that song either, really. I always thought it was a bit disappointing. I was always surprised it was a hit, but that I'm pretty sure is about his elder sister. And of course,
yeah,
so he was the baby boy and much loved and
yeah,
spoiled.
yeah. Golden
And
Child.
then 3 years later, another baby boy
Oops.
comes along, Dave,
Yeah.
who sort of slightly usurps his position. And it's sort of, and that clearly is something that has affected the relationship that goes on between them the whole the
Mm,
whole time.
mm.
We know their spats are quite legendary.
Yes.
So
Yeah. Well, I mean that makes the song "Rosie, Won't You Please Come Home" even sadder. Then I mean, even without knowing that, which I didn't when I listened to the track, you started with this absolute thumper, as you mentioned, "Party Line," and then you go into this beautiful but sort of heartbreaking tune about this missing woman, with beautiful, simple lyrics in it as well. There's a lovely lyric in it which goes, "Your room's clean and no one's in it." It's kind of heartbreaking stuff. But yeah, to set it in that context of his sister having emigrated, he was obviously missing her terribly, makes it even sadder, actually. But and actually, that tonal shift is something that you see through the album as well. So you
Mm.
go party line, upbeat, lovely. Then you go rosy, desperately sad, very much sort of melancholy, downbeat. Then you go into a track Dandy, which is I've referred to it as a jokey song. I mean, the great thing about this album is like even the bad songs are good. So Dandy wouldn't be my favorite, and it's a little bit. I can imagine Vic Reeves singing it. It's
Well,
kind of
Herman's Hermits covered it.
When you're old and grey, you will remember what they said. The two girls are too many, three's a crowd, and four you're dead. Oh, dandy, dandy, when you're gonna give up?
I think but it sort of follows a little bit of that dedicated follower of fashion kind of thing.
right.
I
Yes.
think it's a snipe at Dave,
Do you?
yeah,
That's funny.
who was well known for being a quite foppish
A
in his
jackanapes.
fashion choices. He was a jackanapes in his fashion choices. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's funny. That I wonder if indeed your theory is correct, and it was about Dave. So Dandy and obviously dedicated follower of fashion, which is not on this album, but I think was the year
It's
before,
around the same time.
around
Yeah,
about the same
it's
time.
the beginning of the year.
If they were both sort of having taken the piss out of your younger brother, and he obviously played on the track, whether he realised, it's quite funny if he didn't. So yeah, you get these amazing tonal shifts.
Yeah.
So Dandy is then followed by another really sort of troubling track, really. And when you know about Ray Davis and what he was going through at the time, he'd had a bit of a breakdown, I believe. Too Much on My Mind is the next track, which is probably symbolic of, well, A, his state of mind, but B, also this shift. Some critic wrote this was symbolic of the shift from the hard driving beat music that they had excelled at in the past.
There's too much on my mind. There's too much on my mind. And I can't sleep at night thinking about it. I'm thinking all the time. There's too much on my mind. It seems there's more to life than just to
I mean, it's interesting when you think about,
Yeah.
this breakdown that he'd had
Mm.
earlier in the year, and clearly that was affecting his mood. And we think
Mm.
obviously America was part of that, but the schedule that these guys were running at the
Mm.
time, there's a really good book which talks about, I think it's called All Day and All of the Night, which is literally almost the Kinks day by day.
Yes.
And they are going off and they're playing in Porthcawl and Eltham and Dundalk and Kirkcaldy, and then they
Yeah.
go abroad, and they would go away, and then they come back and record, or they do a TV show, or they,
Exhausting.
it was an incredible schedule that
Mm.
you just wouldn't. And the fact that and if you just go back to Party Line, I say this, there's a line in that which is, "I'm not voting in the next election."
Yeah.
And the reason I bring that up is this was written around May 66, and the
Yeah.
election was a really big deal. The 1966 election, which was a Labour landslide, was the last election where you had to be 21 to vote.
Yep.
And so it was the first time that that Ray will have voted, or
Mm.
Pete will have voted.
Mm.
That's just how young they were. And I say it. So when you go Too Much on My Mind,
Yeah.
it's not surprising when you think I'm doubting that the electoral decision was one of the things that was particularly on their mind, but just how young they were and the punishing schedule that they were given,
Yeah.
and to produce, to constantly produce.
And you mentioned Pete there. That's Pete Quaife, who's the bassist in the band.
Yeah. And a childhood friend from up in Fortisgreen as well.
Yeah. Must have been exhausting for him being around the Davis brothers, I'd have thought. And indeed, he had a terrible car crash, didn't he, in June of that year, I think.
He did. He
Um,
did. And
which-
and quit the band, which he was always kind of threatening to do,
Yeah.
and was replaced by John Dalton for a while through some of this.
Yeah.
And then he came back, and then he left, and he came back, and then ultimately he left in about 1969, and then John Dalton did take over full
Right.
time from him. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, you mentioned Nicky Hopkins, the very talented keyboard player, who played those lovely harpsichord pieces in a few of the tracks. You also mentioned John Dalton there. There's also a disputed, an unnamed session bassist who, according to Shel Talmy, the producer,
Yeah. Yeah.
but that never happened according to him. But according to Ray Davis's autobiography, they got this mysterious bass session musician in to play on 6 or 7 of the tracks, but no one can remember who it
Could
was.
easily have been Jimmy Page or John Paul Jones, who
Incredible. Wow.
who had been on a lot of an early Kinks
Yeah.
records. So, and they were huge session men at the time,
And
long before the Led Zeppelin days.
talking of session men, there is a track called Session Man, which has some bizarre lyrics in, but quite entertaining nevertheless. He's a session man, a chord progression, a pop musician, where it strikes me that he is having a pop at those people, because it's all about they only play to time, they never do overtime, they're in and out the studio, different studio every day, and it sounds like he's talking in rather derogatory terms about those people to me.
He never will forget it all. The day he played at the Albert Hall. A million sessions ago it seemed. He's a session man. A chord progression. A top musician.
Particularly because his delivery sounds a bit snide, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Session man, it's all a bit. He's spitting it. I would also put forward the flip side, which goes, I think there's part of when you talk about their punishing schedule that goes, I really wish my life was a bit more like that.
Maybe there's a bit of jealousy in there as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
But and we've mentioned Pete Quaife's car crash, and I mean, this is a bit of dark humor here, but I wondered that track Rainy Day in June, maybe that was the day he had the car crash. It was thanks to the rain. But that's an incredible track as well. It's dark, it's moody. It starts with I'm going to mention a sound effect here of thunder. I mean, the whole album, Ray Davis saw as a kind of concept album, and he wanted it stitched together with all these different sound effects, almost to be one continuous aural piece of narrative. But I think that the record company made him back down from that. But you still get these vestiges, you still get a few sound effects. So you get this amazing sort of thunder sound effect in this, which I can't imagine that Jim Morrison didn't hear that and use it on Riders on the Storm a few years later.
Misty shadow spread its wings, covered all the ground.
It's a real moody track, that, isn't it?
I mean, I find it the song that sticks in my head the most off this album, apart from probably Sunny Afternoon. I mean, it's so ominous. Mick Avery's drums at the start,
Yeah.
on the toms, just this sort of relentless beat coming in. The reckoning is beckoning. What a line that is. It's and it talks also. Actually, there's elves and gnomes are cowering. Is a line which suddenly made me think, because that's the kind of thing Robert Plant was writing.
That's very proggy, isn't it?
It was very proggy, and funny. And I thought this is a song that feels to me like it's off the first Black Sabbath album, which I know you'll be there going, "Hey,
I'm going to listen to that now."
It does. It feels very much like that. It's got that incredible. I mean, you don't think of the Kinks being this dark, but that is a really dark song.
Yeah, it is, and I love it as well. But again, this is up and down the whole way through this, because that's followed by a track called "A House in the Country," which, let's get the elephant out of the room immediately, must have inspired Damon Albarn, right, to write. He lives in a big house.
Believe he didn't. I can't believe he hadn't heard that. Yeah.
but then tonally that track as well. It's got it reminded me of Glad All Over because it goes boom boom house in the country, and I just every time I hear it I want to go Glad All Over because that track was what, a couple of years before.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
About 64,
yeah,
January 64.
yeah.
House in the country and a big sports car. He's got a house in the country and a big sports car, but he ain't got a home. Oh no, and he's as wicked as
So incredible tonal shifts. And again, when you get into side two, you've got again, I like all of the tracks on this album, but probably Holiday in Waikiki is one of my lesser, least favorite tracks. But again, you got this lovely sort of sound effect of sea waves crashing on a beach, or
Well, I love Holiday in Waikiki,
yeah.
and because I think
Tell us
this is the
why.
one that sounds like, it sounds like the Stones.
Yeah, yeah,
It's got like that sort of Brian Jones guitar lick. There's sort of
yeah,
a little guitar lick's got dive bomber bass. It sounds like 19th Nervous Breakdown.
yeah.
It's tremendous. I absolutely love it.
I won a competition in the lifting column in my local paper. So I packed my bags and flew across the sea all on my local paper. I sailed to Hawaii in the USA. I'm just an English boy, what a holiday in Waikiki. I didn't realize it was commercialized.
And I quite like this sort of fish out of water story he tells. I'm an Englishman in Hawaii, which I think they'd stopped off on a tour. And
I think they did visit it in '65 on the
yeah.
ill-fated US tour that you've mentioned previously.
Ill-fated indeed.
Yeah, but Every Cloud, because perhaps that partly inspired the style of writing that we're seeing on this album, which I just find really.
I'm certain it does. I'm certain it does.
But you've got other character-based tracks on this, like Most Exclusive Residence for Sale, which is the track that follows Holiday in Waikiki, which again, it feels like Ray is sort of having a pop at this character. It sounds like a young man who's done well for himself, bought a massive house in the country. Does this all sound familiar so far? But then he gets in trouble with the law and he has to sell up and he can't even pay the servant's way.
Spent all the money that he had. Had a fault and not a head. He spent it all on girls and fancy jewelry. And he found himself in front of a judge and jury. And the judge said to pay up or you must sell.
Well, I mean, it's like Sunny Afternoon, but sort of from a different spending position. He does a lot of these around this time, and one of the things, I'll talk about further listening. But he writes a lot of songs that are sort of about the upper classes or the middle classes, and he's quite Mr. Pleasant.
Yes,
he got a well-respected man.
yeah,
They're all of it. It's all about, but what goes on behind the curtains isn't what you think, and it's all sort of quite soap opera-y, even if it is fairly wealthy. But yeah, it's interesting.
I want to dwell a bit on the track Fancy, primarily because it's as the Australians are fond of saying, it sticks out like red balls on a dog. It feels like it doesn't belong on this album. And it's been held up this whole album as maybe a forerunner to psychedelia, and definitely this track feels like a real, psychedelic type of track. You get this sitar sounding guitar, because I'm not sure the sitar is listed as one of the instruments they actually play on this album, but it certainly sounds like a sitar, even if it isn't one. And to me, and listening to it in the context of this album, it just feels like they're experimenting with something that they doesn't. It's not really them, but they feel they ought to because it's that time.
Well, the interesting thing is that they'd actually almost started it because they had a single the year before called "See My Friend,"
Mm,
which had that kind of sitar-y effect on
mm,
it. Um, and they sort of always talk about the Beatles discovering it, and it's George Harrison that sort of leads it. But that sound is there. It's on "Paint It Black" by the Stones, which is also
mm.
'66. That was a sitar that they played.
Yeah.
Um, but the Kinks had a sound like that previously, so it
Mm.
wasn't unknown. But I think your point is right. It doesn't feel quite right within this um, album, apart from the fact it's yet another change of pace and tone and flavor. So
It just felt like they were playing at it to me. Lyrics like "My love is like a ruby." Oh God, the worst kind of hippie
yeah,
stuff. You know, I mean, again, I don't mind the track; it's fine, but it feels out of place here.
yeah.
And almost to prove that point, the track that follows it is "Little Miss Queen of Darkness," another kind of character based, um, deep and rich and presumably based on someone he'd seen in a club on the King's Road or something. I don't know, but it feels much more their heartland. It feels much more them to me.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's kind of got a Brit pop shuffle to it again.
Yeah,
And a bride in golden hair was not all that it might seem. Little Miss Queen of Darkness dances sadly on. Yes, little Miss Queen of Darkness dancing, dancing on.
I said I kind of thought it sounded like it should be made by somebody like the Kooks, not the Kinks. The Kooks
presumably
should
the
do it.
Kooks are named in honor of the Kinks, aren't they?
Well, you would have
Must be,
thought so.
must be.
Yeah.
But yes, you're right. I can imagine them doing it. What one of my friends likes to call indie landfill, the Kooks. Um, we must talk about Sunny Afternoon. It's the penultimate track on the album. As I mentioned at the start, this is the only track that I knew, and I'm sure, you know, 99% of people listening to this will have heard the track. I think it's a bit overlooked, this track, purely because it's played so much. It's an absolute masterpiece of a song. But I think I just take it for granted a bit because I've heard it so
Yeah.
often.
I mean, it's on advertisements, it's in films, it's on TV
Yeah,
things. I mean, and but actually, if you say what's the best song on this album, much as I love Rainy Day in June, it is this. It's just you can't really say it because, well, yeah, but we all know that one.
yeah,
But actually, there's so much in this song,
yeah,
that it's an incredible arrangement.
yeah,
It's got that sort of honky tonk piano. It's got that sort of wheezy kind of vibraphone
yeah,
sound going on, and then an incredible sort of little guitar coda at the
yes.
end that you don't kind of you sort of don't notice all these things, but
It's almost tossed away at the end of the track, isn't it?
yeah, but it's actually incredible. And it was number one when England won the World Cup.
Wow.
In the summertime, in the summertime.
The sunniest of all
The
afternoons for football
sunniest of
fans.
all afternoons.
Yeah.
Yeah, to your point earlier on, where you mentioned this gradual shift from uh, albums being just something to keep the fans occupied in between singles
Hmm.
to albums being a creative pursuit in their own right and more important artistically and musically. So if you were to hear Sunny Afternoon as a fan and buy the album on the back of that, then I think you've got a good representation of what that album is. I think do you know what I mean? It's a really
Yeah.
good representation. You'd go away, you'd buy the album, you think, I've not been misled in any way here.
Hmm.
Because it is a huge departure. If you were a fan of You Really Got Me or All Day and All the Night, it's a huge departure from that. And this whole album is a huge
Yeah.
departure from that. So what an incredible piece of work. I'm so grateful to have been able to listen to this anew 58 years on. It's
Well,
incredible.
I'm delighted. I'm delighted you enjoyed it. I mean, I find it enjoyable. I mean, one of the things we hope to do with the Twilight Turntable is
Mm,
obviously also to encourage you to perhaps explore further what other things you'd recommend. I mean,
mm.
I think you could do a lot worse than listen to the next two
Yeah.
Kinks album, Something Else by the Kinks and the Village Green Preservation Society,
Yep.
which is both of which were in the Rolling Stone top 500
Yep.
albums ever, as was also, I would recommend, um, a sort of odd compilation called The Kink Chronicles with a lot of K's in it.
All the K's. Yeah.
All the K's, which sort of gathers together really good B-side tracks and album offcuts and things like
Yep.
that. And it's well worth discovering. It's very good for looking at this period in their career. So
Okay.
that would be my further listening for anybody who is interested in it. I think it's a really valuable album. There's a lot going on in it. There's a lot that's important, and there's a lot that influences not only what we all see coming with Britpop, but I think it influences a lot of the other bands around it, including the big ones.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of merit in this.
For sure. You've mentioned to me in the past, Eleanor Rigby, for example, might have taken some inspiration from this kind of approach and this very English sort of character-based, waspish, observational kind of stuff.
Yeah. It's certainly and certainly getting a little bit more into that kind of slightly musical or 1930s nostalgic feel.
Yeah.
I mean that McCartney does that a lot. When I'm 64, Your Mother Should Know. I mean he needs no encouragement to kind of get into those sort of slightly old style.
Well, since
Dixieland or whatever it is.
Yes, since the Twilight Turntable can double as a confessional booth, I'm going to share something with you now, Tone. As you mentioned, Your Mother Should Know. I listened to that track, having not listened to it for a long time. I listened to it during lockdown, and it genuinely made me cry.
Oh,
yeah,
I can understand that. It's a very it's a lovely track, actually.
Made me cry, and then I went to myself, "You stupid boy."
Yeah, well, it was a difficult time.
Now,
it was a difficult time.
We mentioned the tidbit of information at the start of the top of the show, didn't we? About this album starting with a phone ringing, and as we've been speaking, I thought to myself whether the Blondie album Parallel Lines starts with Hanging on the Telephone, because that famously starts with the phone ringing, and was it the first track? I've gone and looked in my little collection, and God damn it, it is the first track. So there you go. That's my offering.
There you go.
Parallel Lines by Blondie.
I thought, doesn't Adele Hello start with the phone ringing?
I don't know.
I think it does. That might be 25 or.
It's easy for her to name her albums, isn't it?
Yes, it's very easy.
How old am I today? That'll be it then.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple. I'm sure. Everyone out there can.
If anybody knows any more that records that start with a telephone ringing, we don't want all songs with telephone ringing. Telephone Line by ELO, for instance, but it's not the opener, so we're not interested.
It's got to be the first sound that you hear on the album, as it does on this on Face to Face.
Yeah.
Would you like me to give Face to Face a score?
I think you should.
I'm going to give it. It's going to get 7 out of 10. 7 out of 10 for Face to Face. Which listen. I was thinking about giving it an 8, but I'm going to go with 7 because I don't want to leave myself nowhere to go for future offerings. So 7 out of 10, which it's a university first, isn't it? A Jeff Hurst, if I can make that reference, since we've been talking about 66 and all that.
Why not?
A solid 7. It's a brilliant album, genuinely brilliant album. And I will go and listen to those other ones that you mentioned there. It's funny, isn't it? Because I've come to this one, and this is really the first Kinks album that I've listened to properly. I can't believe that there's going to be anything that's going to top this, honestly. But I'm prepared to. I'll keep an open mind.
Well, this is. I think a lot of people see it as the end of their first phase.
Yeah.
I definitely see it as the beginning of their second phase.
It feels more seismic, doesn't it, as a shift from where they were.
Their previous albums are interesting, but they're not. They just feel like they're just filled with tracks to keep people interested in the band rather than that. Yeah. I mean, the other thing it should say just before we finish off is it wasn't terribly successful. There'd been a delay over issuing it. And Pi Records who had a budget label called Marble Arch, which is also the name of the studios it was made in.
Yeah.
They did a sort of rush release of some of a sort of a hit compilation of Kinks songs called Well Respected Kinks.
Right.
And that sold really well. And
Yeah.
I think people are going, well, I can only afford one Kinks album. An album was an expensive thing. And it sort of cannibalized on the actual original release. And what's even crazier is that happens the following year as well with something else.
A
which
veritable
also doesn't really
embarrassment of riches if you're a fan.
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, that's been
I'm pleased you've enjoyed that.
It's been a whole lot of fun, Tone. I really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it.
Great.
I'm looking forward to the next one already.
Good. Well, I hope everybody who has tuned in and stuck with us this far decides at least to, if not go and listen to this album, to go and listen to another one and listen to it.
And we'll be back with our difficult second album soon, hopefully.
Indeed, we will. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Tone. See you soon, mate.
Arrivederci.
We'll see you next time at the Twilight Turntable,
where we'll be trying to change the world one late night long player at a time. Please try listening.